Panic over a possible pandemic. President Trump trying to put that to rest with a press conference. He says, we're on it. The Democrats are coming after him with everything they've got, though, making this political before we even know what's going to happen. We've got that and a lot more coming up on the Buck Sexton Show.
We have, through some very good early decisions that were actually ridiculed at the beginning, we closed up our borders to flights coming in from certain areas that were hit by the coronavirus and hit pretty hard. And we did it very early. A lot of people thought we shouldn't have done it that early, and we did, and it turned out to be a very good thing. And the number one priority from our standpoint is the health and safety of the American people. That's the way I viewed it when I made that decision. Because of all we've done, the risk to the American people remains very low. And we have the greatest experts in the world, really in the world, right here. The people that are called upon by other countries when things like this happen. We're ready to adapt, and we're ready to do whatever we have to as the disease spreads, if it spreads.
Welcome to the Buck Sexton Show, everybody. President Trump giving a press conference last night in which he was able to address really all of the broad strokes of the concern over coronavirus right now. Here's where we are. Right, you've got about 80,000 cases. You've got a few thousand that are either dead from that or looking like they're in critical condition. Right, we're in a precarious spot now. 2,700 is the total death count so far. A vast majority of that in China. And now everyone in the media has turned into something of an epidemic expert. Epidemic, by the way, on the people. Pandemic, all of the people, if you want to know the Greek. And really, it's just pandemic is just a way of saying a really bad epidemic. And you can already see that this is one of those twists of fate, one of those historic moments when, Donald Trump was in such a position, a glide path, it felt like, toward re-election. Bernie Sanders, socialist, the whole thing. The Democrats are in total disarray. It looked like a joke. They threw everything they had at Trump. And not only did he manage to keep going beyond the Russia collusion farce and the special counsel, and then the most preposterous impeachment proceeding in the history of the United States government. He's been doing phenomenally well as president all along. And I tell you that, and I know that usually if you want to get people's attention, you want to be a catastrophist. You want to walk around and exaggerate a problem, and if someone doesn't agree with you, say, "How dare you?" That's the way to get attention. People have this. We have this basic need. I mean, it goes into the fear center of the brain. Here's this terrible thing that could happen. And there are a lot of ways that people in power, and media is a powerful institution in this country, that they try to manipulate that fear center in your brain and get you to do things or get you to think things that you would not otherwise. I tell you, President Trump has been doing a very good job as president, and also, so far, they have been doing a highly competent job with trying to stop a mass spreading of coronavirus inside the United States. We are not responsible for what happens in China. Isn't it interesting, though, that China is a police state, an authoritarian regime, and has all of this technology and all this enormous, this incredibly vast security and surveillance apparatus? And you'd think that they would be able to have such a highly efficient response to this. And I can just tell you, obviously it started in China. They were caught unaware. The government lied about this. There's a lack of transparency that the Chinese regime is always engaged in. But if you were to take it on an apples to apples comparison, how China, the authoritarian communist, but kind of communist regime, deals with something like this versus what you would see in a country like Japan, for example, which has a very developed, very advanced health system, public health system, you'll see that there's still an advantage to countries with greater transparency and countries where there's more accountability in the regime. There's this leftist mentality that if only you empowered a government to do whatever needs be done, as long as that government was competent, made of competent administrators. This is really at the roots of American progressive ideology. The competent administrator will solve the problems of the state, then everything gets better. No, that's not necessarily the case. You want checks and balances. You want transparency and accountability because that's what will make the organism of a government most effective at dealing with a crisis like this, because government always wants to protect itself and protect its power. That's the natural state of a government bureaucracy or a government apparatus. This is why I call the intelligence community the self-licking ice cream cone, right? Because ultimately, the intelligence community, they want to do good things and they want to advise the president, but their first priority is really to protect the intelligence community. And that's certainly true of the Chinese regime. It's true of many other countries as well. I think that when I was talking about the historic moment here, there's no question that Democrats see what's going on with coronavirus as perhaps the salvation, if you will, of their presidential hopes, which is a horrible place for anybody to be. That's a disgraceful place psychologically to be, but I think we all recognize that's what's going on here. Democrats are in the precarious position. I mean, I'm talking about Democrats who are very politically involved and part of the power apparatus. I mean, I think your run-of-the-mill Democrat in whatever state is probably actually very concerned about coronavirus more than anything else. But those who are out there criticizing the president, they view this as, look, a crisis is an opportunity. It's one of the most true and most cliched phrases you'll ever hear. And so they're rooting for a crisis here. Before, they were rooting for a recession. Didn't look like it was going to, it doesn't look like it did not look like it was going to happen. Perhaps now it will happen, or there'll be something of a dip in GDP that's substantial in an election year that will be, as I said, the salvation of Democrat hopes. And they may be in this position where if there is a large outbreak of coronavirus in this country, the Democratic Party will be benefiting from perhaps tens of thousands of Americans dying. That's where we are. I recall during the Bush administration when I was working on the Iraq desk at the CIA, and one of the issues that we were constantly involved in was tracking not just, of course, U.S. casualties first and foremost, but also just all casualties in Iraq, all violent trends in Iraq, so we could have a sense of, are things getting better, are things getting worse? And I had friends, notably one time a very good friend of mine went in to brief Nancy Pelosi, and it was right during the surge, and it was looking at the Baghdad belts, these suburb areas around Baghdad that had been the sites of tremendous violence. And he told me, he said, when he presented her with the information, you could tell Pelosi's just her whole demeanor, the situation being that violence had dropped dramatically, that the surge worked, and that less people were dying. And you can see, he said, Pelosi's like, oh. And he said that she said, I guess that's a good thing. Now, she would claim, of course, that there's still violence there in the first place is bad because we shouldn't have been there, right? I'm sure she had some way to spin it, but I don't think when you see a chart of somebody seeing U.S. casualties and they're going down dramatically and civilian Iraqi casualties are going down dramatically, you'd say, I guess that's a good thing, but, this is what my friend from inside the government apparatus told me. And I've never forgotten that about Pelosi. So now I know she, of course, if anyone else, she would deny, her staff would deny. I mean, or they'd say that she was referring to something else. But I think we all know that there were Democrats who were clearly rooting for the failure of the Bush administration policy in Iraq. There's no question that was going on. They were actively rooting for failure. I mean, we were losing troops in high numbers for a while there in Iraq at the height of the insurgency. We had thousands and thousands of U.S. wounded coming back, and Democrats would conflate always we care so much about the troops, so we don't want the continuation of these Bush policies with also, well, the worse it is, the better it is for the Democrat point of view. This is the uncomfortable political reality of a crisis, that there are people who recognize that they benefit from the worst things imaginable happening. And that is the situation that Democrats are in right now. That is what Nancy Pelosi is doing. It is what Chuck Schumer is doing. I'm not alone here. The one and only, the great Rush Limbaugh. I mean, he's been saying for the last week or so, just wait until they can find a way to tie this to Trump. And what we've seen is that they have been waiting, hoping, I think we have to use that word, that there would be a real opportunity to seize on to make this Trump's fault. but you have no U.S. deaths from this yet. You have no major outbreak yet, and I'm somebody who thinks that there will. I mean, this is going to spread in the United States. I don't think it's going to spread in true pandemic fashion. It's not going to be the Spanish flu of 1918, but I do think you're going to see a whole bunch more cases of this. You know, there are going to be thousands of cases in the United States, in my estimation. Am I an expert? No, of course not. But are any of these other clowns on TV you're seeing from news? I mean, the difference between me and them is I actually read stuff and I'm honest. They're just like, whoa, how do I look? And let me spray my hair in place and garbage. So I think that you're probably going to have a surge in the number of infections in this country. But they can't wait until that happens because they wanted to get ahead of this and seed the narrative early that Trump is a buffoon, that he's a monumental failure in this, and that somehow this is a result of the gross ineptitude of the Trump administration. That's really what they're hoping will be the takeaway for the American people. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, perfect example of this. She doesn't like the response. She says, "Play clip 2, producer Mark."
This is shameful. Puts forth a proposal now that is meager, anemic in terms of addressing as well. With Ebola, we did $5 billion. Now they're trying to take the Ebola money and spend it here. So what he's doing is late, too late, anemic. Hopefully we can make up for the loss of time. But it'll have to have the professionals in place, the resources that are adequate, and not to be using scare tactics about people coming back to our country.
So the big complaint here is that Trump has asked for $2.5 billion, and there was a larger request for money to deal with Ebola. Now, Ebola and coronavirus. Look, I think this whole moment in time here, where the public is looking at these issues with much wider eyes they have in the past. Those of you who have listened to my show for a long time, what have I been saying for years? For years now is a much more realistic, major scientific concern than, say, climate change. I've been saying pandemic disease. I mean, we could go back. I mean, maybe I'd even, producer Mark, this might take some time, but we'll have to get our imaginary intern to do this for us. But I would love to go back and just show you the number of times where I've raised that if we're looking for the scientific community to protect us from something, it's not climate change. It's this. This is the real thing. This is science, DEFCON 2. This is where the scientists, and this is where I want the smartest scientists in the world, the best medical researchers, microbiologists, epidemiologists. I want them to be on this because they can save. This is game time for them. They can save hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of lives in a short period of time. Not over the next 1,000 years from climate change, pretending that every flood that happens is because you're using plastic bags at the grocery store. I mean, this is idiocy. So, I just would know that I've been telling you that antibiotic-resistant bacteria, that scares me. Pandemics, that scares me. These are real things. There are real things to be worried about, and there's now a greater public awareness of the limitations of our medical community when it comes to understanding these things. There's now reports that somebody was tested 8 times, came out negative, and then developed symptoms after having been in quarantine and came down with the disease. They don't know how fast this will mutate. We don't really understand all that well some of these processes with viruses, with viral particles. We don't know that much about it. I mean, keep in mind, and I know this is a highly simplistic way of looking at it, but I think sometimes starting with basics is very useful. We still cannot cure and really have no treatment other than symptom treatment for the common cold, which results in billions and billions of dollars of lost productivity every year in this country alone. Still don't know how to cure the common cold. So there are huge gaps in our knowledge and ability. There right now is this focus on vaccines, and I'll bring that up in just a moment. But I would say that, right now the Trump administration on the response, what is really the concern that Nancy Pelosi is raising? That they haven't asked for enough money. I mean, Trump has said we'll spend whatever money we have to spend, but what are they really supposed to be spending money on? You'll notice Democrats are very limited on the details. And another part of this that it's a problem for them. What about open borders? What about a policy of making it difficult for the president of the United States, for example, to shut down. Remember, the president used National Security Authority as the commander-in-chief for the travel ban, and they fought that. They said, no, you can't do that. Presidents can't do that. It's so evil. It's so racist. And now everyone looks around and says, wow, you mean there are circumstances where the executive branch should institute a travel ban to protect U.S. citizens? Oh, maybe Trump was right all along, and not just because the Supreme Court told us already that he was right.
Why is the White House message so different from the CDC?
Well, it's just more of the same. This administration, time and time again, whether you're talking about lowering the cost of prescription drugs or a health care plan, infrastructure, foreign policy, their plan is no plan. And the fact of the matter is that we are ill-equipped because we're dealing with this in real time instead of having been able to invest in proactive strategies by having the robust funding necessary to do that. This is an administration that does not believe in science, that has cut money at the NIH and the CDC. And so I'm not surprised that he's completely clueless about how to handle this and how to contain such a pandemic. And that's exactly why I'm here supporting Elizabeth Warren, because we need a president that believes in science and believes in the public health and will make those investments in the CDC and NIH.
Total blather. Nonsense. Absolute, utter nonsense from, that's Ayanna Pressley, a new member of Congress. This is just what you say when you're spreading propaganda because you want power. That's it. There's nothing beyond this. The administration doesn't believe in science. What does that even mean? Keep in mind, the people that are saying the administration does not believe in science, if you ask them to define, I mean this, if you ask any of these Democrats, what is a woman? They will not be able to give you a definition. They won't do it. They can't do it. The left has undefined being female now. Being a woman is not something that they claim, never mind also what they do with 9-month-old babies that are a human being in every way and respect. They reject science in such clear ways. Yet they take this position right now when we should have this view that the country is under attack from a pathogenic invasion and we should be brought together. Instead, they're trying to score cheap political points, and stupid ones.
No, I think you have to always, I do it a lot anyway, as you probably heard. Wash your hands, stay clean. You don't have to necessarily grab every handrail unless you have to. You do certain things that you do when you have the flu. I mean, view this the same as the flu. When somebody sneezes, I try and bail out as much as possible with the sneezing. I had a man come up to me a week ago. I hadn't seen him in a long time, and I said, how you doing? He said, fine. He hugs me, kisses. I said, are you well? He says, no. He said, I have the worst fever and the worst flu. And he's hugging and kissing me. So I said, excuse me. I went there, I started washing my hands. So you have to do that. This is, I really think, Doctor, you want to treat this like you treat the flu, right?
Good advice. That is what we're really dealing with here. It's very similar to a flu virus in many respects. The differences are just we don't know as much about it. We don't know what the incubation periods are. We have less time with this. And keep in mind, most of the experts that you see right now are saying that this is something that is going to become recurrent. Coronavirus will be a thing that is out there. It's going to come back. The vaccination, they had the press conference last night covered a whole range of things. You had, Fauci from, NIH, or is it CDC? I forget where he is, but he's a senior guy. I've interviewed him before. And you had people from inside the administration. Obviously, Mike Pence has been made the coronavirus czar, I guess we'd call him. I don't know what he's in charge of this pandemic response. And the media is using this as an opportunity to jump all over Mike Pence because they hate him because, they say, oh, he's not going to try to protect us. He's going to just thump a Bible or something. They're so bigoted toward Pence because he leads, he tries to lead a traditional Christian religious existence. Here's what Mike Pence said, though, about what's gone on so far. Play 6.
President Trump's made clear from the first days of this administration we have no higher priority than the safety, security, health, and well-being of the American people. And from the first word of the outbreak of the coronavirus, the President took unprecedented steps to protect the American people from the spread of this disease. He recounted those briefly, but the establishment of travel restrictions, aggressive quarantine effort of Americans that are returning, the declaration of a public health emergency, and establishing the White House Corona Task Force are all reflective of the urgency that the President has brought to a whole-of-government approach.
What else were they supposed to do? The criticism from Democrats is pathetic because they don't have any real answers as to what should have been done that hasn't been done. And if anything, when Trump initially had when they initially asked to block flights coming in from China, there was pushback. I saw experts in those early days who were going on TV to say, oh, trying to stop people from traveling, the containment of this is even worse than the disease in a lot of cases because of all the economic damage it does, the fear that it creates. Well, now people are saying, no, that was a good thing to try to prevent the massive spread of this disease. That was probably the right move. Now, there was talk last night at the press conference also about a vaccine. Now, the timeline on that is that we got at least 12, and I would really plan for 18 months where there's not going to be a vaccine for this. They have to go through human trials. They have to see if it works. They have to see if it's safe. There's a whole bunch of stuff. And that's considered lightning speed for a new vaccine for a new virus. But who knows if it's even going. I'm not even sure if we know if it's going to work. I mean, no one's sure if it's going to work, but I wouldn't bank on that. So really what happens now is you try to use all the resources you can to inform the public about this so you prevent the massive spread of it. But I do think it's also a reminder to all of us that, the common flu, for example, can kill people very easily and does kill many, many people across the country and across the world every year. I've had the flu a few times in my life. The flu mortality rate, they say, is 0.0 or 0.001%. But pretty much everybody at some point gets the flu. So that doesn't, when you start doing the math on that, it is troubling. And when people compare this to other pandemics, if you came down with cholera, which is really one of the worst diseases in terms of pandemics for a very long time. I mean, really the top of the scary disease chart, generally you got bubonic plague because of what it did to Europe. But that was in the Middle Ages, and that was also a time when we didn't have antibiotics or any understanding of modern medicine whatsoever. Smallpox went on to kill a lot of people for a long time, even into more modern times. So that was clearly a continued concern. And if you added up the numbers on it, I mean, it's hundreds of millions of people have been killed in the last, I don't know. Well, we don't even know how long these diseases have really been around. So you know that's been a scourge against humanity, a scourge on humanity for a very long time. So you got bubonic plague, smallpox, cholera, which I've told you about the cholera outbreaks here in the 1830s, 1850s in New York City, where I am. That was because you had a great concentration of people here, and pandemics tend to be associated with urban density for obvious reasons, right? People coming into close contact with each other in large numbers. Now we have a new phenomenon in the modern era of people in close contact with each other who also have the ability to travel around the world in a day. So you have mass transportation on a global scale and huge population density and people coming into contact with each other in large numbers, frequently. So that's why we have a much better health system, much better understanding of these things. But pandemic disease is even more frightening in that sense because it can travel so rapidly and can spread so quickly within a certain population. In fact, some of the worst, when diseases are really, really bad, I think there's a kind of flu H5N1 that, the mortality rate is, I don't want to give you the wrong one, but it's very high. But it's so high that it's actually difficult for it to spread because it tends to kill the host in a lot of cases. That's the lag time here for coronavirus because it means that you're having exposure to people while you're still shedding viral particles. That's part of why they think it's a pretty effective spreading mechanism as viruses go. Yeah, cholera, you got a 50-50 chance of living, and it's really quick. It essentially drains your bodily fluids in about 24 to 48 hours. If you get cholera, you are in very bad shape. They can treat it with antibiotics, but if you don't get modern medical help, you have a 50-50 shot of surviving. Ebola, until recently, you had an 80% chance of dying. But the reason that so that's also why the spread of Ebola was it falls in that category of a disease that with public health systems and public knowledge is easier to contain, because the people who have it tend not to go out and have a lot of exposure in public. And also the contagion rate for each individual is pretty low because people don't tend to live. So that's why Ebola is, and also you had to come into contact with blood effectively and have blood come into your system, which is different than aerosolized droplets. Aerosolized droplets, you can walk into a room, you don't know, somebody's sneezed. I mean, this is why these upper respiratory infections that are highly contagious are so concerning to people, because even if you take precautions, I mean, I know there's now this big spike in mask sales online, for surgical masks, and there's been some price gouging. I saw this, floating around on social media, that surgical masks on eBay are going for thousands of dollars now. It is also interesting to me to see that, libs who spend a fair amount of time mocking anybody in the conservative mindset who just wants to make basic preparations for his or her family, especially if you live outside of urban areas where you think that it will take longer for public services and public help to get to you in a pandemic or in an epidemic, or in a catastrophe situation. Yeah, now it's pretty understandable, isn't it, why people would want to have fresh water and food? Because even if the disease doesn't get as bad as some people are worried that it might, the fear can cause a lot of problems on its own. And that's why the president's approach to telling everybody, look, we're on this, we get it, we're not saying it's not a big deal, we're just saying we're on it, we are taking all the steps that we should be taking, and do not panic, be vigilant, we're going to be okay. That's the right tone. And all this stuff you're seeing from journalists about, Trump is not in sync with his CDC on this, and how could he say this, and he's so reckless. This is just politics. It's not, these are not people they're honestly being irresponsible. And you would think if journalists' real job was to inform the public, to give them necessary information so that they can make better decisions about their lives, never mind about politics, that there would just be this focus on getting out the best, most important information possible about this. Of course, that's not what they're focused on. They're focused on, how do we make this about Trump? How do we lay the groundwork for Bernie to have a big surge here, or any Democrat, doesn't matter, because of this situation that has nothing to do in terms of its origins with Trump, but they are viewing as an opportunity. I got to tell you, there's a piece in the New York Times. This is, so if you think, what am I talking about when I say they're being irresponsible? Let's call it Trump virus, is a piece in the New York Times. And then it just goes out of its way to do everything possible to claim that Trump is the real problem here. You have a disease that is understandably concerning people for the possibility of its massive spread. And the New York Times wants you to know that it's Donald Trump's fault. I mean, the disease that the libs have is clear. It's Trump derangement syndrome, and they have terminal cases of it. They're never going to stop. They can't help themselves. And they don't even feel, those who are in the information dissemination business, they don't even feel a greater obligation to inform and help prepare their fellow citizens in the midst of this, precarious situation, concerning situation. It's not terrifying yet, it's concerning. They don't view that as the primary goal. The primary goal is to find a way to bash Trump over all of this. That's the single most important thing that they believe they can accomplish right now. Something else that I got to tell you about from the CDC that just goes to show you, you can't believe everything government tells you. CDC has put out this information bulletin on how some forms of beard, some facial hair, may not be a good idea in the event of this spread, because if you have to use either a mask or a respirator, you will have your facial hair can break the seal. So they're telling people that if we have a pandemic here of coronavirus, the beard's got to go. You can have a handlebar mustache. Mustaches are okay, but actual beards, they say, are problematic. I got to tell you, you only live once. I don't think everyone's going to shave off their facial hair because the CDC says you might have. But, I could be wrong, but I think the CDC is getting a little ahead of itself with that one. So where I come down on this is I think the administration is doing what they can do and what should be done at this point. They are taking it as seriously as they can, as they should. And all the sniping from the sidelines you're hearing from these Democrats is exactly what we've been predicting, which is that they would try to take this opportunity. They would try to take this chance to make this about scoring political points for Democrats instead of coming together in a real civic-minded seriousness about how to deal with this. I mean, you get in a bad flu season, 70,000 people will die and nobody even notices it's a bad flu. How many people even know that in this country? How many people even know that? The flu is very dangerous to older people with more taxed and weaker immune systems. It can also be very dangerous to young people. This will probably fall into that category if and when it spreads here. There will be more cases in the United States. I don't know how many. Nobody knows how many. The experts have given us more or less the information that they have to share at this point that's relevant. They'll have updates as they go along. What measures should be taken at this point beyond what Trump has done? If Democrats had good ideas, I would like to hear them. But complaining about the president's requested budget, guess what? The president doesn't get to create the budget. He doesn't get to appropriate funds. This is just like a mission statement, basically. We all know this about presidential budgets. It's really just something for the pundits to talk about. So if they're just going to complain about that, they're being unserious. But as we know, Democrats excel at being unserious, even in the most serious times, which is what we're in right now with this.
This one is tough. So the way I think about this is first we think about allocation, kind of our overall approach. I'm going to be introducing a plan tomorrow to take every dime that the president is now spending on his racist wall at our southern border and divert it to work on the coronavirus.
The wall is racist, she says, and it should be diverted to coronavirus. I just want to know, does Elizabeth Warren think that there's a problem, perhaps, with the spread of a pandemic disease and a porous southern border? Does she have anything to say about that? When people who especially will be in countries that have public health systems that may be very rapidly overtaxed by this, what do you think those people who are within striking distance of getting across the border illegally are going to do? I think we all know the answer to that. We already know Democrats believe that anybody who comes here illegally should be given the full spectrum of the U.S. healthcare system's largesse, whatever you need. So, yeah, I can imagine if somebody comes down with this and they're close enough to get across the U.S.-Mexico border that you'd rather have coronavirus in the United States and walk into an emergency room here than you would in Honduras. That's for sure. Than you would in Mexico. That's for sure, too, unless you're really rich and you're going through the entirely private healthcare system in Mexico. So what about that? Secure borders in the event of a pandemic. We're now looking at the reality of why we would need secure borders, why we would need travel bans. Democrats don't want to talk about any of this because they pretend that living in this open borders, internationalist world has no risks, has no consequences. We're seeing yet another, never mind the erosion of sovereignty and the economic and political consequences of having a porous southern border. Right now, what we're seeing is the health consequence, possibly. And keep in mind, I was at the southern border talking to Border Patrol, about a year and a half ago, when they were discussing people coming across the border with active cases of tuberculosis, with active cases of whooping cough, with people coming across that have all kinds of high viral loads of HIV. All kinds of stuff, and then that comes into the interior of the United States because the border, the laws that we had on immigration and the loopholes in them. Does anybody think that this is not going to be a problem, especially as we see cases already on every continent around the world, including in South America, including south of our border? Maybe a secure border is a great idea, actually, a very important idea. Elizabeth Warren, the only plan she needs is an exit plan from the campaign. We all know that.